Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Psychology and the Divided Self, Memories of the Sandman. There are four corners to my bed. There are four angels overhead, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I shall die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Hush, little baby, don't say a word, and never mind that noise you heard. It's just the beasts under your bed, in your closet, in your head. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact, a matter of the construction of their inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. A beautiful girl once told me of a recurring nightmare in which she lay in the centre of a large dark room and felt her face expand until it filled the whole room, becoming a formless mass while her eyes ran in bilious jelly up the chimney. Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. Well, hi everybody, and I just thought I'd give a little reprise to the thumbnail of all these googly eyes goggling at us. And I do realise that on this channel I appear to have some weird fixation about eyes, but I'm obviously not the only one, as I'll show from various works of art. And I wanted to look at today, as the title states, the concept of the divided self. So I think it's useful that these eyes are all divided up into little self-contained compartments. And the concept of the divided self in relation to, I'm going to use a relatively close reading of the Hoffmann story, The Sandman. And I've already done a video on Ernst Jentz's The Uncanny, which is an essay that refers to the Sandman. And I've done a live stream with my good friend Richard Grannon. So if you want to see that discussion, it'll remain in the live section. But I wanted to do a closer reading of the Sandman, focusing on the actual text, and also look at this concept of the divided self, because it's written in 1816, the Hoffmann story, but it's amazingly prescient with regards to people like Freud and Jacques Lacan and psychoanalysis. And it depicts, I think if you did a DSM-5 type analysis of the mental condition of Nathaniel, there are elements of mania, bipolar perhaps, elements of his behaviour, schizophrenia, but it's rather a jumble of symptoms. But he's definitely got a divided sense of self, and that leads him to a mental breakdown at the very end of the story. So I wanted to look at that and explore some of the issues behind it, and the way in which the divided self is a natural aspect of the human condition. So I'm going to talk in terms of the interior sense of our consciousness versus the fact that we're thrown into the world, as Heidegger would say, and that we have to relate to an external world. So more than most animals, we're blessed or cursed, depending on how you view it, with a profound sense of self-consciousness, whilst simultaneously being able to manipulate our environments more than any other species. So we have this divided nature at the very core of what it is to be a human being. So I've spoken briefly before about, and I did a whole video actually on the notion of the look, which a subscriber, I think he goes by the name of Ads, is part of his alias, or I don't know if it's his real name, but he kindly mentioned he'd been looking at one of the early videos on the notion of the look. I look at pieces of the text of Sartre where he talks about the look, but linking that to artists like Jean Fautrier and Tissot, and various artists who depict the human glance, which I've always been fascinated with and is an obvious part, important part of the Sandman essay. And then I came across, to keep on the surreal, uncanny aspects of the story. This is a painting from 1529 by a guy called Lucas Furternagel, and it's called Portrait of the Painter Hans Birkmeyer and His Wife Anna. And then I was reading another book. I didn't come across this painting in this book, and a different book all about I think it was something to do with the everyday in the Renaissance, as you do, but the concept of what it was like to live in Renaissance times and what were the daily features. And there's a female scholar called Deborah Sugar, and she talked about how in the mid-15th century, the mirrors that they would have like this looks quite weird, that you'd have these skulls coming out the mirror surface. But she said what they actually had were skulls drawn into the lining of the mirror, so that when you looked in the mirror, a skull would be superimposed over your reflection. So this isn't as odd as it looks. It's, the skulls are coming out of the mirror slightly, which I don't think is particularly realistic from a modern point of view. But the actual notion of seeing a skull in the mirror was this weird Renaissance notion. I think they call them memento moris. It's in the Hans Holbein picture, The Ambassadors. There's a skull at the bottom of that painting. In Anamorphosis, it's distorted. But this concept of in our reflection, in the Ernst Jentz essay about the uncanny, he talks about the way in which children have a notion of animism. They give objects, they'll talk to them or see themselves in objects. And for young children or primitive peoples that have concepts of totems, the idea is that it's a way of increasing your presence in the world. You see yourself doubled, you see yourself reflected in other things. But as people grow older, as become more adult-like, and as societies become more sophisticated, the suggestion is that we actually see our double, our doppelganger, as a presentiment of death. So there are lots of stories about meeting your double and it being a prefigurement to dying. So there is this concept of reflections, and it comes up in the Hoffmann story, seeing doubles of everything, and of course the tragic ending. And to put this all in the context of the notion of the interior and the exterior, this is Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich, the German painter. And it's almost exactly contemporaneous with the Hoffmann story. So this is a painting from 1818. And I'm pretty sure the Hoffmann was 1816. I keep forgetting. So almost exactly contemporaneous. And it summarizes beautifully what the romantic artists and poets and writers were increasingly interested in, this relationship of our imagination to our external environment, the notion of individuality and our role in nature. But this just summarizes it brilliantly. This idea that we have, and also the trick is that we're tempted to see the point of view of this man stood on this rocky outcrop. From memory, I think it's an amalgam. It's based on the sandstone mountains in Bavaria and Saxony, but it's not one particular site. He was very familiar with the area, Caspar David Friedrich, but he did some amalgamation to produce this picture. And we get the sense of solipsism, or the individuality of the person looking out on this beautiful scene. But also it's almost like the Hitchcockian. It reminds me of the scene in The Birds from Hitchcock, where you're looking at the birds looking down, and you suddenly realise, well, hang on, it's literally a bird's eye view, so it's quite funny from an optical point of view. But then you have to ask yourself, well, who's above the birds? And it's us, the viewer, taking, it's not even a bird's eye view, it's like a God's eye view. And similarly, it's a clever way. We're looking at someone looking. We're looking at someone with a sense of... we're looking at someone's interiority from our own distance. So there's so many layers to this painting. It's about their internal consciousness, but it's about us also not being able to be in touch with that internal consciousness, because we're external to this person in the painting, just as he is external to his environment. They're separated, and so are we. So there's this. I just love the idea. There's these layers of separation, and then this is from a collection's Tales of Hoffmann from 1932, but I'm going to use a few images from this book collection because I love the illustrations. And I like this because back to this idea of the internal versus the external and how that affects or refers to psychological conditions. This is obviously an external scene of somewhere. It reminds me personally of Prague, but Middle European townscape, yet it almost it's got a sense of interiority. It's outside, but it, maybe I'm just babbling, but it just strikes me there's almost like a mental quality. It's almost like looking inside. It's almost like a urban representation of the brain, if that makes any sense. But this is Mario Labochetta from 1932 did the illustrations. So, to try and convince you about my interpretation of those illustrations, the concept of the Umwelt in German means literally environment or surroundings. And then you have Innenwelt, which means inner world. And these come from this German biologist, and there is dates. And I'm going to quote him in a second because he was interested in the relationship. This is why he came up with these terms. The relationship that various animal species have with their environment and how their environment in turn structures, at least partially, their consciousness. So this is another guy, Thomas Nagel, who I think illustrates this distinction that this Jacob guy came up with. In reverse order, Thomas Nagel, I've included a link in the description to this essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, which is a brilliant short essay about the impossibility of human beings putting ourselves inside a bat's head. Because if you think about it, bats have this audio ecosystem, spatial awareness, which is almost like a form of sight to them. I'm guessing their actual eyesight is pretty poor, but they do sonar echoes to find their way around. Now, that would be almost you see through your ears, which to a human being is bonkers. But it works for bats. Similarly, I'm thinking of dogs. Their sense of smell is exponentially more powerful than us. And I think I'm right in saying that when their vision is biased towards movement, so they don't see precisely the way we do, and they're geared towards being obsessively interested in their owner's face, because that has an adaptive evolutionary advantage that, you know, they want to know where their next treat's coming from if my dogs are anything to go by. So just because we live in the world with other animals and the world is an objective spatial place full of objects, our consciousness of that physical space and the difference in the consciousness of various species is a fascinating question for philosophers like Thomas Nagel. I also recommend, it's a book, The View from Nowhere, which he takes this idea of, as human beings, we have a perspective. So back to the Caspar David Friedrich painting, there he is, the embodiment of having a perspective on the world. But we have that physical perspective. Yes, we're thrown into the world, as Heidegger would say, we're based in the world. But where is our consciousness? So this idea, the view from nowhere. Human beings appear to be unique amongst the animal kingdom because of our ability to self-reflect and the high degree of self-consciousness. But that doesn't seem to be based in any physical sight. You can't locate the precise point in the brain, which is just this gelatinous mess in our heads. It's Is it in the crenellations of the brain? Is it in the frontal lobe? And is it in the bicameral interaction, as Ian McGilchrist would argue? It's, you can't identify. It's consciousness is an incredibly complicated, weird thing when you think about it. And that's what Thomas Nagel's writing about. But I think this Umwelt, Innenwelt, and the concept of consciousness has direct bearing on the Hoffmann Sandman story, because Nathaniel, the main character, has effectively a mental breakdown. And I think if you followed the DSM-5, whatever, there are elements of manic behavior, bipolar behavior, schizophrenic hallucinations, delusions. So it's a bit of a potpourri of psychological conditions. But ultimately, I think this distinction between the Umwelt and the Innenwelt is directly relevant to this concept of the divided self. And what I'm arguing is that, according to lots of people, like philosophers and psychoanalysts and people like Ian McGilchrist, neuroscientists, our brain is divided, yet our consciousness works to bring things together. So, and as artists would show, like David Caspar Friedrich, we are placed in the world and we are separate from the external world, but we're also part of it. So this idea of being divided selves is part of the human condition. But when people like Nathaniel lose touch or suffer a trauma and they're thrown out of kilter, then they suffer mental imbalance and mental illness. And that's hence the divided self. So the rest of this talk is all about how in the story various aspects of the psychological condition of a divided self are exhibited. And then this just amuses me, because I've been in public discussions and arguments, debates, whatever you want to call it, with crass Darwinians, as some regular viewers will know. But this is a title of one of Nagel's books. Not exactly succinct was our Thomas. I think he's still alive. Don't want to wish ill will on him. But Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. So there you are, you neo-Darwinists. According to Thomas, you're wrong. Now, I'm going to quote, this is the Jacob guy. Notice I'm skillfully avoiding pronouncing his surname. But Giorgio Agamben is an Italian political theorist, philosopher, and he wrote this book, Open, Man and Animal, and I've also put a link to that in the description. And relating to this idea, so it's a bit like Nagel's idea of what's it like to be a bat, our friend Jacob, the following is a description from him of what a tick experiences, which I found equally amusing and interesting. So here we go. This is a tick's eye view of the world. This eyeless animal, so not much of an eye view, this eyeless animal finds the way to her watch point at the top of a tall blade of grass, with the help of only its skin's general sensitivity to light. The approach of her prey becomes apparent to this blind and deaf bandit only through her sense of smell. The odour of butyric acid, which emanates from the sebaceous follicles of all mammals, works on the tick as a signal that causes her to abandon her post on top of the blade of grass or bush and fall blindly downward toward her prey. So the constant emphasis upon the lack of sight. If she is fortunate enough to fall on something warm, which she perceives by means of an organ sensible to a precise temperature, then she has attained her prey, the warm-blooded animal, and thereafter needs only the help of her sense of touch to find the least hairy spot possible and embed herself up to her head in the cutaneous tissue of her prey. She can now slowly suck up a stream of warm blood. Anyone feeling itchy? So in the Jentz essay, he links the uncanny with uncertainty. So I've looked at this previously. But what I wanted to pick up on here is I'm going to start making the direct links with the Hoffmann short story, The Sandman. But this is Jens talking in his essay, the feeling of being threatened by something unknown and incomprehensible that is just as enigmatic to the individual as his own psyche usually is as well. So this idea that I just think it's a nice way of thinking about the things that we find uncanny in the world about us are a reflection, and I use the word advisedly because reflections come up all the time, and doublings, and the concept of sight, obviously. It's just as enigmatic to the individual as his own psyche. So we're alienated, as I was saying earlier, from our own psyches. We can't access purely our own psyches because we're also a body in the world. And that was the point of the earlier quote about the tick on a blade of grass going through. Its behavior and its way of seeing the world is highly structured by its purpose, what it was designed to do, and that's how it's conscious of the world around it. Now, we have more choice than that, but still, I'd argue it's part of the human condition to be both internal and externally aware. And this is a quote from Hoffmann himself. I imagine my ego as being viewed through a lens. All the forms which move around me are egos, and whatever they do or leave undone vexes me. So that's Hoffmann, he's quoted in Otto Rank's The Double, which is an essay I might look at in future. But I just find it interesting. This is Hoffmann talking, and the way he spoke about his own ego viewed through a lens that has obvious relevance to the Sandman story, especially the ending. And before I move on now, I'm going to start talking more in terms of psychoanalysis. I mentioned all this. I don't often refer to scientific material, but I'm hoping if there's anyone in the viewership who really is into their science, I think the Thomas Nagel and some of the other material I've pointed to, the whole current debates about consciousness, offer an interesting way of thinking about the Hoffmann story, because I'm arguing the Hoffmann story represents this internal-external division that is a basic aspect of biology and has been pursued by philosophers of science. So I'm not very knowledgeable about science. I spend all my time reading literature and philosophy, but I do find the interplay of the scientific material about consciousness and how it's reflected in stories and images quite interesting, because more often than you'd think, the literature actually illustrates some key scientific ideas. But I wanted to talk about the concept of a palimpsest, if you've ever heard of the phrase, but this is what one is. It's basically an old manuscript that's been written over, but retains traces of what existed there before. So this is the Codex Ephremi Rescriptus, which is a Greek manuscript of the Bible, and this was circa mid-5th century, so it's 425 to 450 AD. And why I'm showing you this is I'm using this as a representation of what arguably the human mind is like, because not only do you have the internal-external division, the external world and internal consciousness, within our internal consciousness, you have memory. And memory is based... Freud makes... I've put a link in the description to an essay Freud did, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But he uses this concept of a palimpsest. Jacques Lacan, who I'm going to most probably look at in the next video, mentions palimpsest a couple of times, but not very often. But he is aware of the obvious, to me, link between a palimpsest like this and how the human mind works. So this is, Freud referred to this as the mystic writing pad. And he wrote an essay about it, which is, I've put the link in the description. And I just think this is a wonderful practical illustration of memory, because apparently there's a film a celluloid film that goes over the wax-like material you can see there. And when you write on it, obviously words appear, but when you lift up the celluloid, the words disappear. But Freud's point was you can see tiny traces of what was written in the wax-like substance beneath. So he used this as an analogy for how the human brain works. And it's a concept, memory is in the Hoffmann story, and it's a concept I want to explore more in future. And if people join me on the reading group in the new year for Proust's À la recherche de temps perdu, one of the reasons I'm fixated on that novel is it's all about memory and the psychology of memory and how over our lifetimes we relate to the memories of the past. And the problem for Nathaniel in the Hoffmann story is he has traumatic memories of childhood that he can't process, that keep reappearing, and he has symptoms of behaviour, and the behaviour is symptomatic of the unreconciled memories of trauma. So part of the whole psychoanalytical emergence from people like Freud and Lacan, one of the purported reasons for having psychoanalysis in the first place was to help people process trauma and traumatic memories. And I'd strongly argue that that's also what literature does automatically and naturally. It's the collective memory of communities and cultures where they condense wisdom and they condense representations of our fears. So we'll see as we go along very shortly, but Nathaniel in the Hoffmann story initially incorporates the concept of the Sandman to his trauma. And you can imagine a scenario in which thinking of his trauma in terms of the fairy tale of the Sandman might give him some relief. But as the story progresses, it's his failure to move beyond the figure of the Sandman. The figure of the Sandman invades his conscious adult life. So it's no longer a safe fairy tale. It becomes actually much darker and psychologically damaging, so that it divides his self to the point that his ego is completely destroyed. So that's the mystic writing pattern. It's a short, beautiful essay by Freud. I personally think Freud, some of his ideas, he mad as a box of frogs, but he writes, if you just want to read, I think people fail to read Freud enough just for the beauty of his essay writing. I think he was a stunning writing, and we'll find out, he's a stunning writer, and we'll find out in the next video when I look at Lacan that he has some amazing ideas and the odd purple passage, but he's not as good a stylist. He's often impenetrable compared to Freud. But now I wanted to pick this out. This is from the tale, so I'm going to start getting into the tale itself, but I've taken this is towards the end of the story. And I think this is a key comment. The professor of poetry and eloquence took a pinch of snuff, clapped the lid of his box too, cleared his throat, and said solemnly, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you not perceive where the trick lies? It is all an allegory, a sustained metaphor. You understand me. Sapienti sat," which means in Latin, enough said for the wise. But this concept of allegory and sustained metaphor, this is the narrator describing how this, when everyone starts to discuss in the story this Automaton Olympia and why Nathaniel's fallen in love with basically a robot, and the people around Nathaniel can't understand how he could be so gullible. And then you get this comment towards the end, but it's a sustained metaphor. It's a fictional professor of poetry and eloquence, which is quite amusing. But it's a professor of poetry being narrated about in a fictional story, but making a meta-commentary about the idea that all of this is a sustained metaphor. What's a sustained metaphor? Well, I'd suggests that the sustained metaphor is there are various metaphors in the Hoffmann story about eyes, about vision, which I'm going to argue is all about insight. The sight is a metonymical expression of insight. So throughout the short story, Nathaniel's scared of people taking his eyes away, taking his ability to see, which could be seen as a concept of he's fearful of losing his self-insight, his self-consciousness, his sense of ego. And the whole story is about the amount of self-consciousness, or the relationship of your internal state to your external relationships to the rest of the world, to maintain sanity. And when you lose it, when the self is divided too much, what happens to Nathaniel is the psychological trap you fall into. And there's going to be in future a whole metaphor is a concept I'm going to explore in quite a lot of depth, because it links. I made the point earlier about the relationship between science and literature that I'd suggest I haven't really looked at enough. The concept of metaphor I find intriguing, because there's a whole branch of cognitive linguistics called conceptual metaphor theory that has built up a body of knowledge and theory about the foundational aspect of metaphor to human thinking. So before we even begin to conceptualize, according to a lot of these theorists, metaphors are at the basis of human cognition. And given, as you can see in this quote, literature, almost part of its essence is to be metaphorical. So I've long been arguing that reading has a privileged place in human cognition, and that a lot of contemporary problems are caused by the loss of reading, the way in which we're reading less and less and less. That relationship to metaphor and the importance of metaphor for human conceptualization, all of these things fit together. So I'm going to try and find ways to make it more interesting, because some of the conceptual metaphor theory can get quite technical and dry. But if I can relate it to short stories and various novels, hopefully, like I say, for people who are interested in science and not just art all the time, some of these crossovers are really potentially quite intriguing. So here we dive into the story itself now. Daily, so this is from the Sandman. Daily and hourly I think of you all. It's the first letter of Nathaniel. He thinks he's writing to his friend, stepbrother almost, Lafleur, but actually he writes to Clara by mistake. Daily and hourly I think of you all, and the dear form of my lovely Clara passes before me in my dreams, smiling upon me with her bright eyes. So right from the beginning, eyes are mentioned, as she did when I was among you. But how can I write you in the distracted mood which has been disturbing my every thought? A horrible thing has crossed my path. Dark forebodings of a cruel, threatening fate tower over me like dark clouds which no friendly sunbeam can penetrate. I particularly wanted to quote this because I'm going to show you a painting next. And I think the relationship between this quote and this painting demonstrates the way it's an underlying purpose of the whole channel is the relationship between art and literature. But coming across, rereading this quote recently made me think of the painting I'm going to show you in a different light. So I think it's interesting, it's just a very practical example, at least personally for me, as to how my view of a painting could change because of something I read. So this is a painting I've shown before, but it's René Magritte's painting The False Mirror, 1928. Sorry. So if you look, the dark forebodings of a cruel, threatening fate. But it's brought together here. I've emboldened the two sections that made me think in the Magritte painting. Smiling upon me with her bright eyes. So the concept of a bright eye, but then this notion of a dark foreboding. Sorry. Passing before me in my dreams. And the dark forebodings of a cruel, threatening fate terror of me like dark clouds. And then in this painting, you don't see dark clouds. They're actually light clouds. But I've always been focused on the dark pupil. And that's what made me think of this painting in a different way. They're not dark clouds, but there is a sense of the dark cloud of the pupil. Because that is the thing in someone's bright eye that reflects back the sky in this painting. Magritte calls it the false mirror, because it doesn't reflect back everything. There is a hole at the centre. And when we look at Jacques Lacan's work, he has this theory that there is a hole at the centre of meaning, because language, by its nature, can't express everything. There's always a gap. So these associations I made after rereading the Hoffmann quote, it just made me look at this Magritte painting completely differently. And then this is, I quoted in the previous video, but my favourite quote in the whole Sandman story. So this is the nursemaid talking to Nathaniel when his mother's told him the Sandman story doesn't, the fairy tale's non-threatening, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just when you're tired. But the old nursemaid says, "Hey, Natty," said she, "don't you know that yet? He's a wicked man who comes to children when they won't go to bed and throws a handful of sand into their eyes so that they start out bleeding from their heads. He puts their eyes in a bag and carries them to the crescent moon to feed his own children, who sit in the nest up there. They have crooked beaks like owls so that they can pick up the eyes of naughty human children." So this goes directly to the question of to what extent can you process trauma? To what extent can fairy tales, in this instance, be used as a cathartic mechanism to take care of some of our concerns and fears about life? And Bruno Bettelheim, in the Uses of Enchantment, brilliant book about fairy tales, he basically argues that this is what they do for children. Children enjoy being scared. And and this is one of the things, less and less children have fairy tales read to them now because of, the eternal babysitter of online screens. But Bettelheim's describing the way in which, in very subtle but also profound ways, fairy tales encapsulate psychological conditioning about how to deal with being scared. And the amount of children who like to be told scary stories. And there's a condensed wisdom in fairy tales, which I won't drone on about, but I've spoken briefly about it before, and hopefully in the future I'll go back to it. But if you're interested to pursue it, Bruno Bettelheim, The Uses of Enchantment, is one of, and is it Mary Tatar, 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 is a brilliant, she's done quite a lot of accessible books about fairy tales, and a lot of them are illustrated beautifully, so if you can look up her work, I thoroughly recommend her too. So this is when he's talking about the Sandman. Coppelius comes to the house and works with his father in this. The Sandman comes. He associates Coppelius with the Sandman, but he's talking about Coppelius here. His intercourse with my father began more and more to occupy my fancy, yet an unconquerable fear prevented me from asking my father about it. But if I myself could penetrate the mystery and behold the wondrous Sandman, that was the wish which grew upon me with the years. The Sandman had introduced me to thoughts of the marvels and wonders which so readily gain a hold on a child's mind. I enjoyed nothing better than reading or hearing horrible stories of goblins, witches, pygmies, etc. But most horrible of all was the Sandman, whom I was always drawing with chalk or charcoal on the tables, cupboards, and walls in the oddest and most frightful shapes. So this relates to what I was saying before about Bruno Bettelheim and the possibility that scary stories like this are actually very useful for children. The problem for Nathaniel is, and I think it's why he associates the Sandman with Coppelius, this Coppelius basically abuses him, and he's unable, he tries to cathartically get rid of the abuse through associating him with the fairy tale, but it doesn't work because the trauma is too deep. And this introduces this quote that one of the aspects of Nathaniel's character is he's incredibly curious, he's driven to be curious, he wants to penetrate the mystery. And the work that his father is doing with Coppelius is basically, we think it's alchemy, but I just want you to remember that word intercourse, because that, I'll do my perverted psychoanalytical reading in a second. This is what I think, it's just, I think this is from an Indian version of a Hoffmann book, the book cover. And it's interesting because the eyes are closed. It doesn't work for me at all. But then this does work for me. It doesn't have any eyes, but it's the notion of the shadow. There's a concept of dark shadows running throughout the story, as we'll shortly see. So when I now saw this Coppelius, the frightful and terrific thought took possession of my soul, that indeed no one but he could be the Sandman. But the Sandman was no longer the bogey of a nurse's tale, who provided the owl's nest in the crescent moon with children's eyes. No, he was a hideous spectral monster, who brought with him grief, misery and destruction, temporal and eternal, wherever he appeared. And this is thoroughly recommend you have a look at this. This is by Paul Berry, just a short animation called The Sandman from 1991. And this is the depiction. It's just about 9 minutes, and it shows the nurse's story of the Sandman is portrayed in those 9 minutes. It's brilliant. So my father opened the door of what I'd always thought to be a cupboard, but now I saw that it was no cupboard, but rather a black cavity. This thing about cavities and black holes all the time, in which there was a little fireplace. And as my old father stooped down to the fire, he looked quite another man. Some convulsive pain seemed to have distorted his mild features into a repulsive, diabolical countenance. He looked like Coppelius, the doubling, whom I saw brandishing red-hot tongs, which he used to take glowing masses out of the thick smoke, which objects he afterwards hammered. I seemed to catch a glimpse of human faces lying around without any eyes, but with deep holes instead. I'll quickly move on after I say this, because I'll get told off for just doing the typically perverted, pervy psychoanalytical reading. But remember the earlier phrase, his intercourse with my father. In Freud, there's a concept of the primal scene. I think it's called the Urscene in German. But it basically means seeing your parents having sex as a child, not fully understanding what's going on, but it's a traumatic primal experience. I don't think it has to be literal. I don't think Nathaniel has to have been actually abused, although I think maybe there's a strong hint. But you have to ask yourself, is it a metaphor or is it literal that the father and Coppelius are doing alchemy? And if they are doing alchemy, the idea says I seem to catch a glimpse of human faces lying around without any eyes. Are they trying to create automatons, as later Coppelius does with Olympia and the is it Spanzani, the guy who he works with later on, who again is a double for Nathaniel's father. There's constant doubling and reflection of something. But if they're trying to create life, that's almost a metaphor for sexual intercourse. And there's a phrase, if you think of if you said someone's going at it hammer and tongs, you misses. But here, objects he afterwards hammered, and Coppelius, whom I saw brandishing red-hot tongs, hammer and tongs is mentioned in the actual text. But this is the image of the heads without eyes. And that's a constant theme throughout the story. So coppo means eye socket in Italian. And when later on Coppelius takes, I think it's Coppola at this point, but it's basically Coppelius takes Olympia away from his collaborator, and the phrase is, there were black caverns where eyes used to be. So this is when he's in the cupboard, he sees these faces where eyes used to be, but it happens later on in the story too. There's the dark cupboard itself, and at one point there's a Capella. Remember, later on, Coppelius reappears, we think, as a guy called Coppola. Coppella in Italian means crucible, like they'd use to burn things in alchemy. So there's loads of word plays going on. And then when Nathaniel becomes fixated on Olympia, and he's the only one left with her in the ballroom, there's the phrase, the last two lights in the empty ballroom had burnt down to their sockets. So this goes on constantly. Eyes here, eyes, roared Coppelius tonelessly. Overcome by the wildest terror, I shrieked out and fell from my hiding place upon the floor. Coppelius seized me and, baring his teeth, bleated out, "Ah, little wretch, little wretch." Then he dragged me up and flung me on the hearth, where the fire began to singe my hair. "Now we have eyes enough, a pretty pair of child's eyes," he whispered, and taking some red-hot grains out of the flames with his bare hands, he was about to sprinkle them in my eyes. So he's become a demonic version of the Sandman. There's another book. I really love book covers as illustrations sometimes. My father upon this raised his hands in supplication, crying, "Master, master, leave my Nathaniel his eyes." Whereupon Coppelius answered with a shrill laugh, "Well, let the lad have his eyes and do his share of the world's crying, but we will examine the mechanism of his hands and feet." And then he seized me so roughly that my joints cracked and screwed off my hands and feet, afterwards putting them back again one after the other. "There's something wrong here," he mumbled, "but now it's as good as ever. The old man has caught the idea," hissed and lisped Coppelius. But all around me became black. A sudden cramp darted through my bones and nerves, and I lost consciousness. A gentle warm breath passed over my face. I woke as from the sleep of death. My mother had been stooping over me. So this is interesting because, well, first of all, there's this phrase that I think is quite enigmatic: let the lad have his eyes and do his share of the world's crying. So with insight comes crying, with sight comes crying. But Coppelius is more interested in the mechanism of his hands and feet. So there's almost like the two different ways of thinking. There's the artistic and literary and the insightful psychological way of thinking. Let the lad have his eyes and do his share of the world's crying. And then there's the mechanistic, exploring the mechanism of things, which is what Coppelius represents. And then at the very end, the mother, who'd previously told him there was no such thing as the evil Sandman, she represents the repression, being told everything's going to be all right, when there are these two other modes of thought. Rather than repression, you have the mechanistic way of thinking, the power of science, and you have the Nathaniel's constant curiosity, wanting to find out how things work. So there are these different competing forms of either knowledge or repression going on. And I showed this before, but I just love this painting. Salvador Dali, The Eye, from 1945. Is the Sandman still there? That was my first sensible word, and the sign of my amendment, my recovery. I have only to tell you now of this most frightful moment in all my youth, and you will be convinced that it is no fault of my eyes that everything seems colourless to me. You will indeed know that a dark fatality has hung over my life, a gloomy veil of clouds, which I shall perhaps only tear away in death. Now, I think, again, personally, the point about literature is that it evokes and it resonates, and there aren't necessarily literal meanings. And it's my criticism of Freud. Who am I to criticise Freud? But he tends to adopt quite literal interpretations of the story, the Sandman being all about actual fear of castration, and the taking away of the eyes represents the castration of Nathaniel. I think it's much more, I think that's too literal. I think this is more about the trauma, whatever happened to Nathaniel, whether it's an actual trauma of an actual physical abuse in the dark cupboard with this Coppelius character and his father. And that would explain, it is no fault of my eyes that everything seems colourless to me. So Hoffmann stating explicitly, it's not a physical problem. And there's the phrase, this made me think of the phrase feeling blue. It's not about sight, it's about your feelings and how traumatized feelings can create these sensations. But I think this is a really intense description of the psychological condition that follows a trauma. And he'll only perhaps tear it away in death, the gloomy veil of clouds. And then Clara's completely opposing response. I must honestly confess that in my opinion, all the terrible things of which you speak occurred merely in your own mind and had little to do with the actual external world. This split between the internal and external again. Old Coppelius may have been repulsive enough, but his hatred of children was what really caused the abhorrence you children felt towards him. So it's the Clara is this dismissive, more practical response. Ah, my dear Nathaniel, can you not then believe that even in open, cheerful, careless minds may dwell the suspicion of some dread power which endeavours to destroy us in our own selves? If there is a dark and hostile power laying its treacherous toils within us, by which it holds us fast and draws us along the path of peril and destruction, which we should not otherwise have trod, if, I say, there is such a power, it must form itself inside us and out of ourselves. Indeed, it must become identical with ourselves. For it is only in this condition that we can believe in it and grant it the room which it requires to accomplish its secret work. Now, if we have a mind which is sufficiently firm, sufficiently strengthened by the joy of life, always to recognize this strange enemy as such, and calmly to follow the path of our own inclination and calling, then the dark power will fail in its attempt to gain a form that shall be a reflection of ourselves. So I'd suggest this is quite insightful from Clara. Well, and shortly after this, she actually says, Lafleur, her brother, adds something that she doesn't quite understand, which I think, given the complexity of what she's saying here, I think it's quite misleading. I think Clara is able to interpret in quite a sophisticated manner, but she's always playing this role of I'm too simple to understand or I'm too practical minded. And in this is like a manifesto for repression. Basically, grow a pair, deal with it. Don't let this external thing become part of you, which goes back to this internal, external, Umwelt, Innenwelt distinction I was talking about earlier. But if only it was that simple. Lefebvre adds that, this is Clara still speaking, Lefebvre adds that if we have willingly yielded ourselves up to the dark powers, they are known often to impress upon our minds any strange, unfamiliar shape which the external world has thrown in our way, so that we ourselves kindle the spirit which we in our strange delusion believe to be speaking to us. It's the phantom of our own selves, the close relationship with which, and its deep operation on our mind, casts us into hell or transports us into heaven. And this is, I think this goes to the core of what the Romantic poets and artists were trying to do. If it's basically, if you can absorb or take at least partial control of this inner phantom, it's what casts us into hell or transports us into heaven. The Romantic artists and writers were incredibly emotional and hypersensitive in some ways, but this is what allowed them to produce such great art. And this is the constant Faustian bargain. Creative people tend to suffer much more mental illness. This is Nathaniel writing to Lefebvre, talking about Clara. She's written me a very profound philosophical epistle in which she proves at great length that Coppelius and Coppola only exist in my own mind and are phantoms of myself, which will be dissipated directly I recognize them as such, which is basically, I was saying earlier, what the psychoanalytical process tries to do. If you recognize these phantoms for what they are, they don't have the control over you. And this now refers to Spallanzani, the scientist who lives opposite, because Nathaniel has to move. This thing about fire throughout the story as well. He has to move because his apartment burns down, but conveniently all his papers are saved by his friends. Then he lives opposite Spallanzani, who's working. He thinks it's her daughter, but it's the automaton he's working on. And at this point, Spallanzani takes on the role of his father, who was also experimenting with the Sandman, Coppelius, who's now become Coppola. This constant doubling. So I know not what curiosity impelled me. All the way through, Nathaniel's impelled by curiosity. It's a constant theme. A very tall and slender lady, extremely well proportioned and most splendidly attired, sat in the room. She did not appear to see me, and indeed there was something fixed about her eyes, as if I might almost say she had no power of sight. It seemed to me that she was sleeping with her eyes open. That's another book cover that really illustrates that previous quote. And then I found this interesting. This is the actual narrator, who at this point really takes on some of the psychological similarities of Nathaniel himself. So this is the layers of the story that are so complicated, or quite cleverly done. This is the narrator speaking. Have you ever known something that has completely filled your heart, thoughts and senses to the exclusion of every other object, which happens to Nathaniel? There was a burning fermentation within you. He's always talking about hot fires, Nathaniel. Your blood seethed like a molten glow through your veins, sending a higher colour to your cheeks. Your glance was strange, as if you were seeking in empty space forms. Sorry, as if you were speaking in empty space, forms invisible to all other eyes, and your speech flowed away into dark sighs. But every word, everything that takes the form of speech, appeared to you colourless, cold, and dead. You hunt and stutter and stammer, and your friends' sober questions blow like icy wind upon your internal fire until this is almost out. Thus I was forcibly compelled to tell you of the momentous life of Nathaniel. Again, this forcibly compelled, that's how Nathaniel is described all the time. I also think in a previous video that I did on the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, the Ancient Mariner is compelled to tell his story, his traumatic guilt for having killed the albatross. And in this story, Nathaniel tries to speak to Clara, tries to tell his story, but she's not interested. And he bonds with Olympia because he's able to tell her whatever he wants. And she just goes, she's the perfect listener. And it's quite, I go back to the Ancient Mariner, because in the Ancient Mariner poem, there's the Ancient Mariner has to browbeat a wedding guest who's about to go into a wedding, and he has to force him to listen initially, but quite quickly, it's very cleverly done, the wedding guest become like the reader, becomes absolutely fascinated as to what's about to happen and gets dragged into the story. And that's true of this story, that there are people like Clara in the Sandman tale who don't particularly want to listen, but we, the reader, become increasingly intrigued. Perhaps like a good portrait painter, I may succeed in catching the outline in this way, so that you will realise it is a likeness even without knowing the original, and feel as if you had often seen the person with your own corporeal eyes. Perhaps, dear reader, you will then believe that nothing is stranger and madder than actual life, which the poet can only catch in the form of a dull reflection in a dimly polished mirror. I think that's interesting, that the relationship, the narrator is relating the act of narration, the act of writing, the act of reading to, and feel as if you had often seen the person with your own corporeal eyes. So you're reminded that you, the reader, are not seeing all this with your own actual physical eyes. So it's a commentary upon the act of narration. And again, this internal, external, we can read a story that is representing external events in a certain sense, because they're events purported to have happened in the world, but actually they're fictional events. They never happened. But we're seeing them with our imagination, which is incorporeal. Our imagination, when we read it is not a form of corporeal eyes as described here, which the poet can only catch in the form of a dull reflection in a dimly polished mirror, which I think is a direct reference to, this is the St. James Bible translation of Corinthians, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as also I am known. I've used it before and I'll use it again. I think it's a brilliant depiction of the dark reflection through which human beings experience knowledge. And this is the Mario Labocetta illustrations again. So this is, I'm trying to remember this bit. He even went so far. Yeah, this is the narrator talking about what Nathaniel did still. He even went so far as to say that it is foolish to think that we do anything in art and science according to our own independent will. For the inspiration which alone enables us to produce anything does not proceed from within ourselves, but is the effect of a higher principle without. Again, it's the Umwelt versus Innenwelt. And the Romantic poets and artists were, again, obsessed with this. Where does creativity come from? But Clara grew very serious and said, "Yes, Nathaniel, you are right. Coppelius is an evil, hostile principle. He can produce terrible effects like a diabolical power that has come visibly into life, but only if you will not banish him from your mind and thoughts. So long as you believe in him, he really exists and exerts his influence. His power lies only in your belief." Which isn't really helpful, Clara, because this is, I think, the point that Jentsch makes in his paper on the psychology of the uncanny. Belief works even if it's not true. This is the placebo effect. But the point about the placebo effect is it works. It has practical consequences. So I think Clara's set up in the story as a, inverted commas, practical minded, serious person. But I think it's Hoffmann's way of throwing doubt upon a belief system that doesn't pay enough attention to psychological conditions, this relationship between the Umwelt and the Innenwelt that Nathaniel embodies. I don't think personally Clara comes out of the story too well. Maybe I'm getting soft and I'm just too sympathetic to Nathaniel. I'll start rounding up, but I think this is beautifully written. Finally, as they were standing at the altar, so this is the story that Nathaniel tries to tell. And remember, this is a story about stories, but Nathaniel tries to explain to Clara his fears in story form. Finally, as they were standing at the altar, the hideous Coppelius appeared and touched Clara's lovely eyes. They flashed into Nathaniel's heart like bleeding sparks, scorching and burning as Coppelius caught him and flung him into a flaming fiery circle, which flew around with the swiftness of a storm, carrying him along with it amid its roaring. The roar is like that of the hurricane when it fiercely lashes the foaming waves, which rise up like black giants with white heads for the furious combat. But through the wild tumult he hears Clara's voice. "Can't you see me then? Coppelius has deceived you. Those indeed were not my eyes which so burned in your breast. They were glowing drops of your own heart's blood. I have my eyes still. Only look at them." Nathaniel reflects, "That is Clara, and I am hers forever." Then it seems to him as though this thought has forcibly entered the fiery circle, which stands still, while the noise dully ceases in the dark abyss. Nathaniel looks into Clara's eyes, but it is death that looks kindly upon him from her eyes. And then I've used this before as a thumbnail, but I absolutely love it. I think this really illustrates the previous quote brilliantly. It's Escher from 1946, The Eye. So then we're on to the way he's looking at Olympia in the distance, across from his apartment. At last it struck him that Olympia often remained for hours in that attitude in which he had once seen her through the glass door, sitting at a little table without any occupation, and that she was plainly enough looking over at him with an unvarying gaze. He fancies himself, doesn't he? Oh, Nathaniel. He was forced to confess that he had never seen a more lovely form, but with Clara in his heart, the stiff Olympia was perfectly indifferent to him. Occasionally, to be sure, he gave a transient look over his textbook at the beautiful statue, but that was all. Yeah, right. This is when Coppelius under the form of Coppola comes in. There, spectacles on the nose. Those are my eyes, pretty eyes, he gabbled, drawing out more and more spectacles until the whole table began to glisten and sparkle in the most extraordinary manner. 1,000 eyes stirred and quivered, their gaze fixed upon Nathaniel, yet he could not look away from the table, where Coppola kept laying down still more and more spectacles, and all those flaming eyes leapt in wider and wider confusion, shooting their blood-red light into Nathaniel's heart. So he's battling his own desire for Olympia, this visual desire in the first paragraph, and then this traumatic intrusion of Coppola again tips him over the edge. For the first time, he could see the wondrous beauty in the shape of her face. So this is him looking at Olympia. Only her eyes seemed to him singularly still and dead. Nevertheless, as he looked more keenly through the glass, it seemed to him as if moist moonbeams were rising in Olympia's eyes. It was as if the power of seeing were being kindled for the first time. Her glances flashed with constantly increasing life. As if spellbound, Nathaniel reclined against the window, meditating on the charming Olympia. And I'm interested in, if you think of contemporary figures like the Kardashians, the blankness that we project on to them. Their secret is that there's nothing really there, so we can project everything onto them. And this is what Nathaniel's doing. He projects on as if moist moonbeams are rising in Olympia's eyes. And I love this illustration from the 1932 edition, because it's almost like it's of the time of German expressionism, but the waviness of the instability of the buildings as he's looking in the distance at Olympia. So you can see how she's right in the middle of that picture. I do think they're great illustrations. Clara is right, he said to himself, in taking me for a senseless dreamer, but it's pure madness, nay, more than madness, that the stupid thought of having paid Coppola too much for the glass still pains me so strangely. I cannot see the cause. I think this is interesting. This is after Coppola's left, and he has this inchoate bad feeling that he can't fully express, and he puts it down to the sense that he's paid too much for the spyglass that he's bought from Coppola. I cannot see the cause. So it's another way of saying he's lost insight. He can't see the cause. And I think it's because he's paid too high a price, not literally, but metaphorically. The lenses that he's bought that will now allow him to focus on Olympia to an excessive amount. At some sense, he feels and senses that, but it's too late. He can't fully articulate it. He's paid too high a price for this visual fixation. And the role of lenses and looking at screens, I can't help but think it has contemporary relevance to the whole porn addiction issue. He now sat down to finish his letter to Clara, but a glance through the window assured him that Olympia was still sitting there, and he instantly sprang up, as if impelled by an irresistible power, seized Coppola's glass, and could not tear himself away from the seductive sight of Olympia. See what I was saying about being addicted to screens in the modern day? Olympia's form floated before him in the air, stepped forth from the bushes, and peeped at him with large beaming eyes from the clear brook. In other words, he's seeing her everywhere. This is when he's out and about. Clara's image completely vanished from his mind. He thought of nothing but Olympia. Stroke Kim Kardashian. And earlier there was he was described as spellbound. And this is an image. If you get the chance, check out Hitchcock's Spellbound. Salvador Dali designed the dream scene, and I think it was originally supposed to be for 20 minutes a scene, and this is what studios do, unfortunately, it got edited down to just 2 minutes. But it's brilliantly surreal. Very Hoffmann-esque. Hitchcock was such an amazing director. Right, so we're getting there now, to the end. Nathaniel stood paralysed. He had seen but too plainly that Olympia's waxen, deathly pale countenance had no eyes, but black holes instead. She was indeed a lifeless doll. Spallanzani and Coppola have had a fight, and Coppola's gone off, but as he drags the doll away, she doesn't have any eyes, is what this refers to. Spallanzani was writhing on the floor. The pieces of glass had cut his head, his breast and his arms, and the blood was spurting up as from so many fountains. But he soon collected all his strength. And now Nathaniel saw that a pair of eyes lay upon the ground, staring at him. These Spallanzani caught up with his unwounded hand and flung into his bosom. Then madness seized Nathaniel in its burning claws and clutched his very soul, destroying his every sense and thought. Ho, 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 a circle of fire, spin round, circle, merrily, merrily. Ho, wooden doll, spin round, pretty doll, he cried, flying at the professor and clutching at his throat. So he has this complete mental breakdown, recovers. Clara still, this silly woman, is interested in marrying him. And this is the very final scene of the story. It was noon, and they were walking in the streets of the city where they had made several purchases. The high steeple of the town hall was already casting its gigantic shadow over the marketplace. And the significance of noon I mentioned in the live stream with Richard, but it's the point at which the distance between your shadow and your body is at its minimum. So it's the whole story has been about the divided, the separated self. And this is when it reaches its climax, when the shadow, the double of the body, is actually as close to the body as it can be. And Clara is the one who starts it. Look, oh, Clara, oh, said Clara, let us climb it once more and look out at the distant mountains. So again, the difference between closeness and distance. Nathaniel mechanically put his hand into his breast pocket. He found Coppola's telescope and pointed it to one side. Clara was in the way of the glass. So this external distant look gets blocked by the excessive closeness to Clara. His pulse and veins leapt convulsively. Pale as death, he stared at Clara. Soon streams of fire flashed and glared from his rolling eyes. He roared frightfully like a hunted beast. Then he sprang high into the air, and punctuating his words with horrible laughter, he shrieked out in a piercing tone, "Spin round, wooden doll, spin round." So at this moment, the whole deck of cards just collapses. The internal, external, the Umwelt, Innenwelt tension just is completely destroyed. And I'll just finish. So he jumps off the tower. And he said earlier on, didn't he, that he'd only find relief in death from this phantom within himself. And I'll just finish again with the David Caspar Friedrich image of what the romantic poets like Hoffmann were trying to do is portray the balance to be found. If you can find the balance, from that great creativity comes. But it's not an easy thing, this balance between the Umwelt and the Innenwelt. But when they get it right, it's beautiful. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.